So, welcome to this evening's Madingley lecture. I'm Rebecca Lingwood, the Director of the Institute of Continuing Education here at Madingley Hall. And first, I'd just like to take the opportunity to introduce our chair for this evening, Professor Paul Linden. And then Paul will introduce our speaker, Professor Stephen Emmott. So, Paul, his research is in environmental fluid mechanics, investigating fluid flows relevant to environmental and industrial applications, and importantly, to do with problems associated with climate change. Paul's research career began here in Cambridge at the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics before moving to San Diego in 1998, where he was the Blasker Distinguished Professor of Environmental Science and Engineering, before returning to Cambridge in 2010 to take up the G.I. Taylor Chair. He maintains his connections with UCSD as Director of their Sustainability Solutions Institute and is very active now within Cambridge University, including associations with the Centre for Sustainable Development in the Engineering Department and some new interdisciplinary forums in Cambridge in this field. So just before I hand over to Paul, can I remind you that if you've brought mobile phones or anything else that might go off during the course of the next hour or so, now's the time to switch them off. So thank you. Paul.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Professor Stephen Emmott. Stephen is the head of computational science at Microsoft Research here in Cambridge, and he's also a visiting professor at University College London and at Oxford in biological computation. Stephen's career began, he was educated in York University, got a BSc in experimental psychology, and then did a PhD at Stirling in computational neuroscience, and then moved to the States, always a good move, at least temporarily, and spent 3 years at the famous Bell Laboratories before setting up and leading the NCR Corporation Advanced Research Laboratory. And then he joined Microsoft in 2003 and has been there ever since. He's serves on a number of panels, such as the UK Government 10-Year Science and Innovation Strategy Committee. He's been a scientific advisor to the Treasury, and he's a distinguished fellow and was a trustee of the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. Stephen, as I'm sure you'll see in the course of his lecture, is very interested in a better understanding of nature and the way we think about the problems that face us, and he's written a very interesting book published in 2013 called 10 Billion, and which considers many of the challenges that we face today. And I'm sure that we're going to hear some aspects of those challenges in this talk. I'm fascinated by the title. I guess he wouldn't have been in the Bush administration if that had been the case. But apart from that, I'll be very interested to hear what he has to say. So please welcome Stephen Emmott.
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for that very lovely introduction. Yes, it's true. If Donald Rumsfeld were a scientist, he wouldn't have been in the Bush administration. But I foolishly chose this title for reasons that will become apparent as the talk gets going. Because he's famous for this. Of course, he's famous as an architect of the Iraq War, but he's also famous as a consequence of that for this statement about what we know and what we don't know, which I'll come to. And it turns out to be quite an important thing that he said, I think, despite the fact that everyone laughed at it at the time. As Paul mentioned, there's some of the things in this, not much actually, relate to a book that I published a few months ago called 10 Billion. And it's about the challenges that we might face. The book's received both some criticism, to say the least, and some praise. It's interesting to see that the IPCC report, the interim ICC report published on Monday, could easily have been called 10 billion because it covered many of the same points that have been criticised in the book. Of course, the IPCC report has been criticised as being alarmist, which I think is a bit misplaced. It's alarming. That's not the same as alarmist. But that's not the subject of this evening's talk. It's about some of the things that we don't know and how we might know them. So without further ado, we can get going. So there's the great man himself, great thinker, as you can see. And he's famous more for this quote than actually probably these days than being the architect of the Iraq War. So he's famous for saying there are known knowns. Well done. These are the things that we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That's to say there are things that we know that we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. These are the things that we do not know, we don't know. Of course, he came under a lot of ridicule for this, but it turns out he really hit upon the sort of crux of epistemological question about the nature of knowledge. And it's relevant to many of the things that I think are some of the most pressing problems for us all this century. And I think for me, at least, as I'm not a physicist, so I'm not going to talk about whether we even know what gravity is or not. But I think many of the most pressing issues that we face this century are to do with biology, ecology, and the environment. And it's relevant to the most pressing problems in those domains. And those are things I'm going to talk about. By the way, I've got no idea how long this talk lasts. So I should warn you. So if it's over by 7:30, there's a lot of time for questions. And if it's not over by 8, someone stop me. So biology, known knowns. So what we do know is that we've had 50 years of spectacular success in molecular biology, culminating, roughly speaking, in 2000 with the mapping of the human genome. So we know a lot about genes, about our own genes and the genes of other organisms, and through their sequencing. We also know a lot about a number of metabolic pathways that various genes code proteins for, control these pathways. So this is, for example, P53 pathway, which is known to be involved. And that term involved is quite an interesting one, an important one, because we don't know what involved means. I'll come on to that shortly. We know a lot about, I'm not going to go through all of these, there's not a lot of point. And there's not a lot of point, actually, because we know, well, I'm going to give the talk away, but of course, but we know a lot about the components here, but we actually know remarkably little about the bigger picture. So this is just one bit of the mitosis-activated protein kinase pathway involved in cell cycle and cell signaling. We know a lot about the components of the epidermal growth factor receptor pathway. This is just one part of it, which is critical for the development of organisms. And we even can do molecular dynamics and some clever imaging techniques to show that this is the actual cell surface receptor molecule. Isn't it brilliant? And we know a bit about the developmental pathways for sea urchin, if you're interested. We, interestingly, the one thing between us all in this room and the cemetery is our immune system. And we know quite a lot about T-cell activation, about the thymus, about how T-cells originate and produce in the thymus. We know quite a lot about, for example, just chose this one, which is called MHC class 1 MHC class 1 system, the major histocompatibility complex 1, including perhaps what molecules such as tapacin do, and how tapacin is involved in antigen presentation on a cell surface to create a T-cell response. And I use that word involved again because that's all we know that it's involved. And I was once a neuroscientist, couldn't hardly call myself that now. But we know a lot about where things happen in the brain. So this is a functional magnetic resonance image of various parts of the brain. You can see at the bottom, at the back. This is where the visual system is. We know where the visual system activation is. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is meant to be sort of state of the art in understanding brain function, but it's the only case I can think of where effectively blood flow is a measure of information processing, which is quite odd. And if one were to be an unkind soul, one could equally make the claim that fMRI is basically phrenology for the 21st century. Nonetheless, interesting stuff, fMRI, and no lab is complete without one these days. We know a lot about the cortex, and a long time ago we knew that it had 6, depending upon your persuasion, 7 layers in the cortex, and different cell types, like pyramidal cells, chandelier cells, and we know something about how the cortex is formed, something about what it does. We know quite a bit about the components of synapses, and this is all the components involved in synaptic cleft, the bit between an axon and a dendrite, and an axon and a dendrite between 2 neurons. There is a point to this, by the way, just bear with me. And we know a lot about myelin, the fatty tissue that surrounds many nerve fibers, particularly in the cortex, to make the action potentials travel more quickly, speed up neuronal function. This is a lovely electron microscope image of myelin. So given all of that lot, which is a remarkable achievement in biological science over the last 50 years or so, in neuroscience, in molecular biology, in immunology, what could possibly be the unknowns? By the way, I'm only talking about known unknowns. Of course, I can't talk about unknown unknowns, because if I could talk about them, they wouldn't be unknown. So I'm just going to talk about the known unknowns. I can already tell you thinking, why did I bother walking all the way up here from Cambridge? And who knows? So the known unknowns in biology are, despite all of that lot, we still don't understand how a cell works, which is quite remarkable in 2014, despite knowing all the components, some enormous amount about all the components in much of what comprises a cell. And for those fellow biologists who would challenge the statement that we don't understand how a cell works, the fact of the matter is the ultimate test of understanding how a cell works would be to build one. And I could probably give anyone who's a biologist in this room, fellow biologist in this room, a tenner to buy all the components to build one. And if you believe you can actually build a cell that works, with all the materials. I don't want the tenner back. And despite all we know about T-cell activation and about the immune system, about MHC class 1 and about tapacin, we don't know how the immune system, we don't understand the immune system well at all. And I'm just going to show you a little movie. This is a movie of a neutrophil, which is basically a white blood cell, a special part of the immune system, a macrophage. And what it's doing here, as I'll show you, is it's deciding what to eat and what to not eat this is actually thrush and a candida. And what's interesting is we have no idea how it does that, how a white blood cell makes decisions about what to eat and what not to eat. And you can see from this, I'll play it again because it is worth playing, that it actually goes around, does some sensing, makes some decision about what to leave, what not to leave. If it does that correctly, you stay disease-free. If it does it incorrectly, it could be very, very deleterious to you and me. So quite fascinating, a simple system such as that. And the key question is, how does it do it? And we're unable to answer that question. Despite, as I said, 50 years of spectacular success in biological science, and it undoubtedly is half a century of impressive achievements, we still don't understand how a sea urchin works. And despite several decades of what are considered to be fundamental advances in neuroscience, we're still unable to answer this question, what is it that the brain actually does? Which is a pretty basic question, one would think, but one we're still unable to even remotely begin to answer. It's interesting that Colin Blakemore, who's a fairly famous neuroscientist, was recently interviewed on Radio 4 about what some of the key challenges were he thought in neuroscience, but biological science more generally. And he quite bravely, well, I say that standing up here saying things I'm saying, but he quite bravely said, the fact of the matter is that biology is effectively defined by the techniques that we've developed, and we don't even really know what the right questions are to ask, certainly in neuroscience, and I think that's a view I would share. I suppose this question is one of the most challenging in biological science. What is it the brain actually does? As I said earlier, I'm of the view that we're no nearer being able to answer that than we were 50 years ago. What's interesting is this is a H1N1 virus, and again, despite all of our known knowns in biology, we're completely unable to predict or prevent or manage, if it happened, a global pandemic. And most epidemiologists are increasingly of the view that another global pandemic of the magnitude that the Spanish flu epidemic of the early 20th century, which was originally thought to have probably killed 50 million people, arguably is now thought to be around 100 million people, would be many more, potentially with a novel flu-like virus that jumps species barrier. But we have absolutely no idea, despite the fact that most epidemiologists think that it's more when rather than if. It could lead to hundreds of millions of deaths when such a pandemic is likely to occur. Could be tomorrow, could be in 83 years' time. But it would be a big deal indeed when it occurs, if it occurs. It probably is when. And it's interesting that given the fact that hundreds of millions of people are now living in very close proximity to pigs and poultry, and given the sort of increasing infringement between humans and wild animals, bats, for bushmeat, other primates, the chances of a global pandemic occurring are increasing daily. So why is there this massive gap between all of the data that we have in biology and our lack of understanding, or our limited understanding of biological systems, how the immune system works, how the brain works, how a cell works? Given the fact that we're not short of computation, arguably. This is a computer that powered what was up until recently called the Blue Brain Project, Henry Markham's project in Switzerland. He's now just got €1 billion, I think, to call it sort of what it's called now, full brain project or something. We're not short of other technological advances. This is a microarray for assaying biological a broad range of biological materials, DNA, RNA, a number of other things, through high throughput sequencing. And some really quite interesting and remarkable technological advances, such as the green fluorescent protein, which a Nobel Prize was won recently, for being able to have entire organisms or fluoresce on the onset of, or switching on or switching off of genes, of manipulation of genes. This is, I think, a mouse embryo, which glows when a particular gene is switched on. So we're not short of some really impressive technological advances in all of this lot. So I think lack of that allows us to collect all of these data. But I would claim that what we have is a lot of facts in biology. And facts are not science any more than dictionary is literature. You need to organize those facts, and the question is how best to organize them. And in some sense, that's an open question, but we do know that asking some new questions some entirely different questions of what biology does might be an interesting starting point. And I think we can best summarize the state that we're in by this analogy about how a biologist might go about fixing a radio. And apologies in advance to a chap called Lazenbyk, who published a paper on this, I think it was about 2004 or something, which is both a remarkably insightful paper and also hilarious. My rendition of it isn't hilarious, by the way, before you get your hopes up. But I'm going to try and clumsily sort of summarize Lazenbyk's paper to just illustrate the point of the state of the art, both the state of the art in biological science and therein the problem with biological science. So how would a biologist go about fixing a radio? So the first thing the biologist would do is apply for a multi-million-pound grant to a research council to buy 1 million radios. And I've worked in such labs. So having once got one's 1 million radios, a team of biologists would set about for decades, first of all, killing 10,000 radios to figure out how to even take the back off before someone discovered there were 4 screws in the corner. And then once having taken the back off, biologists would spend decades categorizing all of the components, like where they are on the circuit board, what color they are, what size they are, how much they weigh, and their shape. And having done that, a new generation of biologists would set about trying to uncover what would happen if you started removing some of these components. So some enterprising postdoc during her work discovers that if you take this out, the sound becomes very distorted, and proudly announces that she's discovered the noise gene, this thing is absolutely completely responsible for everything to do with the sound in the radio, and of course gets a paper in Nature out of this. And then an army of biologists then go about trying to do the same thing and replicating it and seeing what happens if you just take out half of it. And then along comes a product of her lab and discovers that if you take out this other component, it makes the sound even worse, and concludes that, that the thing on the right is related to the thing on the left, involved in the sound pathway, and that the fact that these two are linked is remarkably important because this even further distorts the sound, but it also distorts your ability to get radio 4. So the sound gene is obviously linked to the tuning gene, and that spurs another decade of research into how sound genes are related to tuning genes in these two components. And then, despite the fact that decades of work in that doesn't really uncover much about how radios work, a new technological advance called high throughput crushing means that the remainder of we now have the capability to crush tens and hundreds of thousands, in fact tens of millions of radios in quite a short period of time, and take statistics of their final state. What we discover from that is that radios are made from plastic, carbon, copper, and assorted other associated metals and so forth. And the team that invented this technique and actually were the first to crush 1 million radios and discover the statistics of radios, which were competing with a US team, of course, and it was a team not far from here. Of course, went on to win the Nobel Prize for this remarkable achievement. And the fact is that, of course, none of that tells us about how radio works. It tells us something about the components. And I think that's a really, as I said, it wasn't funny. My rendition wasn't funny, I did warn you. But it does tell us quite a lot, I think, about the state of the art in biological science and why there's a gap between the enormous amount of data that such approaches generate and our lack of understanding about how biological systems work. So can we do any better at a much bigger, let's call it biological scale, which is the biosphere? By the way, I will come to actually what I think we can do about this right towards the end of the talk. So our biosphere, Earth system, not exactly the same, but let's call it, they are our life support system. So what are the known knowns about our life support system? Well, one thing we do know is that our activity is now the driver of pretty much every global problem that we face, whether it's land use for agriculture, or cities, whether it's pollution, whether it's the rising carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, whether it's overfishing, whether it's loss of ecosystems. We do know, as the report, if we needed any further evidence, as the IPCC report on Monday just gone, underlined even further, is that it's our activities that are creating climate change. And it isn't just climate change, although that's what the report mainly focused on. And it's our activities that is likely to lead to problems with food security, water security, security of, let's call them ecosystem services, over the coming decades. And that's now undeniable to most sensible people. We also know that since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we've had an accumulation as a consequence of our activities of carbon dioxide, not just carbon dioxide, but this shows the most important one, which is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is actually out of date. This is principally ice core data on going back in time and atmospheric data from Hawaii that comes out of principally the NASA Goddard lab in the US. And we've shown that we've clearly got this massive increase in carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. This is about 3 years old, 4 years old, this graph. And now it's not 360 parts per million, it's about 400 parts per million, so it's sort of up here. And by the way, during this period, from here to where it is up here, we've had countless government pledges, intergovernmental pledges to solve this problem. And, well, every year it's just continued to go up and up. But this is not to talk about words and inaction from political so-called leaders. It's a different talk. So this is a known, and of course, John Tyndall informed us in the 1860s that if you put a radiative forcing gas, such as carbon dioxide, into a system, it's not entirely a closed system, isn't the Earth? In fact, it's pretty open, but if you put radiative forcing gas into a system such as the Earth, it's going to warm up. And we're just starting to see the first signs of that now. And here are the first signs. So we've more or less had about a 1 degree global average rise in temperature since start of the 20th century. A lot is being made of, if I can find my cursor, which I can't, a lot is being made of this bit. And this apparently is a complete hiatus, decade-long cessation of global warming, apparently. Doesn't look like that to me. No more than this did, or this, or this. And it would be foolish to think that claims that the planet is warming can be dismissed as a consequence of this bit here. In my view, given the fact that we're talking about highly dynamic, highly nonlinear, highly reactive system, which is governed in no small part by the planet's biota, by the planet's biology, principally the planet's plants, which we don't fully understand at the minute. But we do know, this is a known, that the Earth is warming. I could go on, I'm just summarizing a couple of things here, but there are principal known knowns. What are the known unknowns? Well, what's interesting is that when we think about the carbon problem, we think of it as a fossil fuel problem. And here's a bit of a diagram from previous IPCC report. And this shows the amount of fossil fuels that we produce, the amount of carbon that we produce from fossil fuel use, which is, roughly speaking, in total about it's now about 7 point something gigatons. It's estimated, by the way, the 3,700 is estimated to be the amount of carbon still stored underground in fossil fuels, in potential fossil fuel use. And we've used about 224 gigatons were produced of carbon out of that. So despite of claims that we're running out of fossil fuels, the problem is that we keep finding them new ones all the time, and we're probably going to continue to use them. But anyway, when we think about the carbon problem, we think about it as the fossil fuel problem, and that misses a much bigger point. And the point is much bigger because it's this. And it's the fact that this is the global carbon cycle. And the unknown, we know quite a lot about the global carbon cycle, it turns out, but there's a lot that we don't know. But the fact of the matter is that we're modifying every single component of a global carbon cycle right now as we conduct the biggest and most important experiment on Earth, which isn't the one at CERN. It's the one that we're conducting on the planet. And what's interesting is that we're changing quite dramatically, quite rapidly, the marine biota, surface ocean temperature. We're changing the vegetation. through deforestation, land use change, urbanization, as our population grows. So all of these that make up the global carbon cycle, we're modifying every one and we don't know what the consequences are. But we do know that the consequences are probably going to be highly deleterious. And a key question is our modification of the global carbon cycle likely to turn out to be a turbo boost for climate change? And we don't know the answer to that question yet. But the answer could well be yes, in which case we're in even deeper trouble than we thought we were. And we're already in deep trouble. Another known unknown is what's happening to methane as permafrost continues to thaw. We do know that methane in unprecedented quantities is starting to be released in the eastern Arctic ice shelf. We don't know quite how much yet, but it could be big trouble on a very big scale. Chris Hope and colleagues have estimated that just the amount of methane that's probably been released, starting to be released, just in the eastern Arctic ice shelf, in terms of trying to mitigate its effect, because methane is many times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, could be as much as in the order of $60 trillion, which is the size of the global economy. And if permafrost continues to thaw in other parts of the planet, it would be many times more costly to try and sort out the problems that will create. So that's a big known unknown for us. Again, it could mean that we are heading for much deeper trouble than we currently think we're in, if our activities, which is resulting in the just currently modest rise in global average temperature, is causing thawing of permafrost and release of these methane stores. And despite the fact that we ecologists and conservation biologists have spent decades, in fact centuries, counting species, we don't actually know how many species there are. And so we don't actually really know what biodiversity is for. But biodiversity is kind of quite a vague term, and it doesn't really mean much without knowing how many species there are in many respects. But what we do know is that we are altering ecosystem structure and function. So this is a basic food web, which is a sort of good example, an abstraction of a food web, which is a good example of an ecosystem structure and function. And we do know as a consequence of altering ecosystem structure and function through like land use change, species loss through overfishing, through ocean acidification, through consumption, loss of habitat through deforestation, is likely to have a quite profound deleterious impact upon ourselves as a consequence of loss of what's called ecosystem services. So the things that ecosystem, nature provides for free: water, food, and even our climate. So understanding ecosystem structure and function and losses to it is quite an important known unknown. I'll return to this in 2 minutes. And interestingly, probably the most important known unknown is to what extent the changes that human activity are starting to, or the impact that human activity is starting to have on climate and on ecosystems, is whether that will lead to tipping points in the Earth system that could result in quite a short period, a matter of decades, in our entire life support system changing from one state into another one which might not support much life. And much work is going on in this, and the reason why it's a known unknown rather than a known known is that principally because we don't understand very well the role of the planet's biota. We do understand lots about the physical aspects of the climate and the Earth system, clouds accepted, And if you're someone like Tim Palmer, clouds are very important, understandably, as a physicist. But I think we've vastly underestimated the role that planet's biota plays in Earth system regulation. So we're on it, not just us, but biologists working together with physicists are on this now. But this could be a dramatically and profoundly important issue about whether we're heading towards ecological or climate tipping points, which could tip the planet into an entirely different state. So now what? And I've only got 5 minutes left to think about solutions to this problem of some of these important unknowns and the gap between data that we have both in biology in the small scale, from sequencing or from animal models, or on the large scale from satellite data from ecologists and from physicists about the planet. Well, I think it's clear that we need some radically new approaches to doing science to solve some of these problems. And by new kinds of science, I don't mean a new kind of science as Stephen Wolfram would have mentioned it, which was just sort of a computational model using cellular automata. But at least it actually was onto something, I think. Science is an endeavor, really, as everyone in this room will know, which is basically driven by three things, which is new ideas, new methods, and data from experiments or models. We need new thinking to produce new kinds of all of those things, new ideas, new methods, and new kind of data, the kind of data that we need to answer these known unknowns, let alone what the unknown unknowns are. And as I said, one of the things that drives science is really fundamentally new ideas that really kind of change the game, overturn prevailing views in large areas of science. And I think this is an important quote from 1937, which is the formulation of a problem is often more essential than its solution. And I think that we're currently training, which is merely, I might not agree with it merely a matter of mathematical or experimental skill. And I'll mention this right at the end, but I think we're training a generation of scientists to do just the mathematical and experimental skill bit, i.e. try and find solutions to existing questions. But what we really need to be doing is raising new questions, to look at new possibilities and regard old problems from new angles, but fundamentally new angles, I think. And that really requires creative imagination. I think that's something that's completely overlooked in training scientists currently. But it does, as Einstein says here, mark real advance in science. So fundamentally new ideas in science is quite important. And one example is not to think about cells as systems involved in chemical transformations, and think about what cells actually do rather than what cells are, what biology does, or rather than what biology is. What do cells do? Well, cells do information processing and decision making. They do computation. We don't know how they do it, but I think one fruitful way to bridge this gap between biological data and biological understanding is to think about biology as computation, as living software. On a broader scale, how can we bridge this gap between what we know about in terms of climate, about species, about ecosystems, to actually give us a better understanding of ecosystem structure and function and the consequences of our activities on ecosystem services. Well, 10 years ago, when I first joined Microsoft, one of the things that I set out that we were going to do within 10 years was build the world's first general global ecosystem model, process-based ecosystem model rather than phenomenological or purely statistical model. And everyone in my own community, the biology community, everyone in the community that I was just getting started in, the ecology community, said it's absolutely ridiculous, you can't do it. But we built that model in my lab in partnership with some postdocs, both in my lab and just up the road at the United Nations World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And Drew Purvis, who's mentioned there, who's the head of the ecology group in my lab, has really led this effort. And the results from this are being published in PLOS Biology on the 22nd of April. And the initial instantiation of this model was announced just actually about a year ago, and caught the attention of Nature. This is a comment piece in Nature, and it really is time to model all life on Earth if we're going to try and understand the problems that we face in terms of what we're doing to the planet. And this model, which is oddly enough called the Madingley Model, because its conception occurred here in this very room in a meeting that I convened with scientists from around the world when I announced this to say this is what we're going to do, and everyone said it can't be done, except for Drew in my lab and a number of postdocs from the UNEP-WCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, that we hired, and we set about it, and it's now called, as I say, the Madingley Model because it was conceived here. And this could be, this is just a start, and we're hoping that scientists around the world, ecologists around the world will take this model, it's going to be open source, and build upon it and make it better. So this is effectively the equivalent of like what the world's first climate model was, whether in the 1950s or 1980s, depending upon when you think climate models began. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to tell you that it's not based on species, it's based upon what's called functional traits, but you can recover species from functional traits, and functional traits turn out to be very important rather than just species, principally because we don't know how many species there are. I'm not going to focus on this, but it's a model, as I say, it's a process-based model, and it includes all the things that animals do, starting with autotrophs, which is at the bottom of the ecosystem pyramid. I'm running out of time, but I should probably say a bit more about Madingley Model, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. But most importantly, I think, in addition to this new kind of science, to actually even do this new kind of science and build develop rather, the new kinds of computational, conceptual, technological methods to do the kind of science that I think is urgently needed, we need new kinds of scientists to do that. And here's a few of them. This is just a sample of people from my lab. It's not everyone. If anybody's watching, apologies, you're not on there. I didn't have time in doing the slides, but it's only just finished about 2 hours ago, where I didn't have time to put everybody on. But I do think that what's fundamentally important is the development of the creation, the training of a new generation of new kinds of science. It's going to be these new kinds of scientists, people who are computationally first rate, scientifically first rate, and not afraid to challenge prevailing thinking in science, who have been trained to think very creatively and to ask new questions, fundamentally new questions in science, which goes completely against the grain of how science funding works currently, both in this country and indeed in most countries, is going to be critical to solving these problems. And even more critical than that is going to be training, is going to be how we educate today's 10-year-olds or 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds. And the difference between being able to better understand and then hopefully mitigate or adapt to the problems that we face over the coming decades in terms of climate change, ecological change, risks to food security, water security, as well as understanding and being able to predict whether a global pandemic is coming, and being able to better understand the brain, being able to better understand the immune system, is going to be how we educate today's 10-year-olds. And I think we need to radically rethink how we educate today's children to become tomorrow's scientists. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. We have some time for questions.
Thank you. It's Brian Tipping, a Journalist Press Association. Could you give some you left an open-ended question there. Could you give some indications of how the education of 10-year-olds would change from the current plans that Michael Gove has mentioned?
Well, I don't think we can blame the current state of education on Michael Gove.
No, his future plans to change it.
Well, rather than talk about short-term political, of course, it would need political action to change, for example, the curriculum. But I think both at a school level and at an undergraduate level, and certainly once when one becomes a scientist, the way in which individual subjects are taught, as though there's no connection between anything, there's no connection between biology and physics, and no connection between physics and mathematics, they're taught largely independently, I think is a mistake, even for 10-year-olds. I mean, I don't think it's difficult for a 10-year-old to grasp concepts of how things are related, and given the fact that, you know, no one would dream of being able to become a physicist without being mathematically first rate. I think in 10 years' time or 20 years' time, it's going to be impossible to become a first-rate biologist without being computationally first rate. And I don't mean knowing where the on button on your Macintosh is. I mean being able to sort of program, being able to think about conceptual techniques in computer science, and none of those things are really taught. I mean, I know that there is a view now, largely because of some of the work that Simon Peyton-Jones in Microsoft Research has been lobbying government to go beyond ICT education in schools to more computer science education and a broader sort of theoretical, conceptual approach to thinking about computation in teaching in schools rather than computers. I think that's a good move, but I think having a broader educational agenda, I think is probably fundamentally important. And I actually think, rather than talking about the importance of STEM subjects as a potential, no one would deny the importance of STEM subjects, but thinking of them simply in terms of training children and then undergraduates to just get jobs in pharma or in wherever. I think we need to think more fundamentally about what kind of, as I said earlier, what kind of students what kind of scientists that we want. And I think it is scientists who are able to join up all of these things and who are mathematically first rate and computationally first rate and scientifically first rate. And that isn't true of, say, most biologists today. I mean, we try and hire computationally first rate biologists, and although it's changing, it's pretty difficult to find first-rate biologists who are also first-rate computationally. I don't mean bioinformaticians. I mean first-rate sort of modelers who have a different way of thinking, who are willing and able to challenge prevailing views in biology or ecology. By the way, before you answer your question, I don't know what the answer to this is, by the way, but I find it quite remarkable that most 8, 9, 10-year-olds, both male and female, are typically enormously curious about just about everything in the world. And what happens in schools, or what happens between 8, 9 and 10, and then 14, 15 and 16 to 18, for that to fundamentally change is unfathomable to me. I mean, I do not know how that changes, but of course what we want is people who continue to ask why about everything, who are curious about everything on Earth, to then continue that in their degree and in their career. I have no idea what happens between the age of 10 and the age of 18 to sort of that to disappear in the majority of children. Sorry.
Thank you. Heather Maggs, thank you very much. I've got two questions, if I may. The first one is, you say we need new scientists. Isn't the problem we need new humans? Non-tribal, selfish gene status-orientated humans. We can have as many new scientists as we like, but if we don't change the basic human model, surely to God nothing's going to change. And my second question is, have you or are you going to teach your children how to use a gun? Thank you.
Well, to answer your first question, you raised it's an interesting point. I mean, I was simply talking about addressing some of these problems about what we don't know. More broadly, as you've clearly read the book, as I say in the book, I do think that probably the only I might be wrong, but probably the only solution to it is to fundamentally change our behaviour and the way in which we consume. And by our behaviour, I mean broadly our economy, the way in which the planet is run. So I agree. So yes, whether that means new humans is a different issue altogether. But we do need the humans that we have need to change their behaviour. But I confined it to how we solve this problem of addressing the gap between what we know and what we don't know. I don't have children, so there's no one to teach how to use a gun. If I had children, I don't know whether I would teach, given what we face. I don't know whether what I would do. The quote came from someone in my lab, and it was quite a surprise for him to say that. But he said it, so I thought it was important, so I put it in the book.
It's now fairly well established that we have climate change, but what is not yet clear is the extent to which this is man-made as compared with the natural evolution of climate. Is this still a known unknown, or are we any nearer resolving this particular issue? Because whatever happens, we've got to do something about it, but if we could differentiate between the two, it would help towards a solution.
I think there are few in the climate science community that would say that we don't know whether it's largely anthropogenic, i.e. man-made, the current level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and therefore just the beginning, and it is just the beginning of what we're starting to see in terms of global average temperature rise. There hasn't been the level of carbon dioxide that every plant is experiencing, has been experienced on this planet for millions of years. And it's a greenhouse gas, can't deny that. And it's almost entirely caused by human activity. Few people in the science community, I realise there's a lot of people outside the science community and an awful lot in the political community enjoy denying this, but it's really no longer deniable, really.
Although, yes, nobody is denying that there is this influence, but can we apportion the blame, if that's the right word, between natural causes and man-made causes?
In terms of natural causes, which natural causes do you have in mind?
Well, the Earth has a normal change of climate taking place anyway.
Right, just about every model, Earth system model, EMIC model, i.e. Earth system model of intermediate complexity, global, GCM, general circulation model, take into account natural cycles, whether they're from the sun or whether they're even just interglacial periods. So most models in fact, I can't think of no model that doesn't really take that, no serious model that doesn't take that into account. The CO2 in the atmosphere has a very human signature to it from fossil fuels. And one would need to think about what would be an alternative explanation for the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere other than human. Because you see that massive spike that I showed for CO2 concentrations from the start of the Industrial Revolution. No one has come up with a better explanation of what that's due to other than human activity. And given the fact that it's a radiative forcing gas, it's going to cause the Earth to warm up. And we don't know to what extent the massive favour that the planet's plants and oceans, which are currently doing us, is going to continue by soaking up about 50% of all of the CO2 that we produce. into the oceans, and plants take it up. And we don't know to what extent that favour is going to continue. It might not continue at all, in which case the global carbon cycle might turn out, and we're altering, as I mentioned, every component of the global carbon cycle. We don't know to what extent that altering all of those components might turn into a complete turbo boost for even further climate change. That's a known unknown currently. But it really isn't an unknown, it really isn't a known unknown any longer, that the changes that are being made to the planet are human changes. What we don't know is what the full extent of that is. What we do know is that they're going to be bad. We just don't know the full extent of them.
Thanks, Alan McRoby from the engineering department. You got a politician's name in the title of your talk, and a lot of the questions that you're posing can only really be resolved through political power. They're issues of political power. Now, the tech companies like Microsoft, Apple, Google, etc., have got a huge amount of political, economic, and financial might. Do you see there's any way that you can use that?
There's quite a lot of questions in there, really. I think one of the questions was solving probably not the problem of how the immune system works, but the problem of how to better understand the impact that we're having on the planet is going to, and naturally changing that, the outcome, is going to require political leadership, if that's what you mean. And we don't have politicians that have that kind of leadership. If what you're asking me is, should the likes or could the likes of Microsoft, Apple and co influence, I'm not sure what the question was, influence politics? Sure.
I'm not sure of exact figures, but I mean, you can buy the carbon, you can buy the rainforest, you've got massive economic, political, financial clout. You have real power. It's a question of power, and you actually have a lot of power.
I think buying rainforests is not the business that businesses are typically in. If you're saying should there be, that's a different question.
Well,
one thing I will say is that I think it's quite something that Microsoft has had the leadership, let's say, to actually even start a laboratory like the one I lead, to actually better understand these problems. And there's no other company in the world that has such a lab, and that's quite something. You could ask a question: should it be doing more? I don't know, maybe, but it's certainly quite something. That level of leadership to actually have a lab like this, doing this kind of work to better understand these problems, I think.
Mike Bissell from the Department of Geography. One of the known unknowns that you really didn't mention during your talk was the fact that we don't understand how societies work. And you hint darkly this evening and in your book that everything is going to go terribly wrong, but the fact remains that we don't know whether that's true or not, because we don't understand society and we don't understand its interaction with the environment. So what's the prospect for making global models of social systems that will do the job for society that you suggest we might be able to do for ecosystems with the Madingley model?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and a jolly good question. It is true that enormous improvements need to be made in being able to model socio-environmental or just social systems, and we need to do much better at that and integrate them into ecological models, climate models. That said, there are some things that we can model fairly effectively, which is land appropriation for human purposes. We can model the effects of human activities on terrestrial and marine ecosystems empirically and use that data to build models. They might not be completely predictive, and there's an issue about the limits of predictability in models at all, whether it's of people and societies or whether it's ecosystems and climate. And there's a big issue about why uncertainties in models occur and whether they're structural uncertainties and whatnot. And the same would be true of modelling people and societies. So what I'm really saying is that there's a need to model societies more effectively and societal changes as a consequence of environmental and ecological changes that those societies are actually having on the climate and ecosystems, and the impact that has then on society. Do I think that we know enough to be fairly confident that we are heading for trouble, given what we're doing, given where we are? Then I think, as I said to this chap here, I think the evidence is overwhelming that we do realise we're in trouble. Could we understand just how much in trouble better with more effective models of society? Yes, I think so. I don't know whether that's answered your question.
So thank you very much. I think it's now time to draw the proceedings to a close. I'd like to finish by thanking Stephen for a very stimulating and wide-ranging talk. I must say, as an applied mathematician, I'm very on the side of making models, in my case mathematical models, and I agree with the statement that actually solving them is the easy bit. It's figuring out what the right model is. That's the hard part. Formulating the question, that's really the challenge. And people who do it well find the mathematical bits the easy part of the whole process. And I see a lot of connection in this area. And I think one of the things that marks out physics, for example, is that the genius of Newton told us how mechanics works, and the genius of Maxwell told us how electricity and magnetism works. So we do know how radios work, and we can fix them because we know that information, and that's really a very important ingredient, which seems not to be there in a range of other areas. And I think it requires the equivalent of a Newton to come along and find the unifying principles behind many of these things that bring the facts together, a model to pin it on. I think you make the point very clearly and very eloquently, and I agree. We want our young women and young men to grasp these ideas and to be excited about them as much as Stephen clearly is. And so please let's thank him for a wonderful lecture.
So thank you, well, first to Paul for chairing so ably this evening, but also, of course, to Stephen for a really, what I'm sure we know is a really fascinating and thought-provoking lecture this evening. And just as a small token of our thanks, I'd like to give you a gift, which is about the history of the hall and the gardens, which we were talking a little bit about earlier. So,
thank you very much.
A reminder of Madingley Model, if
yes,
nothing else.
Thank you.
So thank you again.
Thank you.
So, of course, as ever, thanks also to colleagues for helping to put this evening's lecture together, for the arrangements, and also to encourage you to return, whether that be to study for us. So you've all got some leaflets and information about what we do here at the Institute of Continuing Education. There are plenty of brochures available on the gallery. So you'd be welcome to join us either for a course or two, but also for future Madingley lectures or for Madingley concerts, our public concert series. So just to give you a little bit of information, our next Madingley lecture is in about a month's time, on the 6th of May, when Professor Ian Cross, who's the director of the Centre for Music and Science in the university, will give a lecture with the title, "What do we mean by music and how can we make sense of it?" And our next Madingley concert is very soon. It's this Sunday afternoon, when we'll have an afternoon of contemporary music for saxophone and piano. So please, you would be welcome to join us again. So thank you for coming this evening. If you're leaving us at this point, please do have a good evening. If you have an invite to stay back, then please just gather here, and then we'll move on to another room in a little while. So thank you.